All right, Douglas London is a retired, decorated 34-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's clandestine service, and Mr. London's experience in the intelligence community includes multiple field assignments for the CIA as chief of station, and he was also director of national intelligence in terms of being a representative of national intelligence, and that was the president's senior intelligence representative. Do I have that right, Douglas?
Yeah, the DNI rep overseas is now the president's ambassador for intelligence at that post.
All right, thank you for setting me straight on that. And you're also the author of The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence, and you also teach intelligence studies at Georgetown University's Foreign School or School of Foreign Service. So it's great to be able to have a chance to talk to you. And I was thinking, what would I say to you in our kind of our opening, and it reminds me when I was based in Moscow that I was sometime after President Putin came to power, probably around 2001, 2002, I was called in by the American embassy. I was the NBC correspondent there at the time, and they said, "We want you to understand that the game is back on." And I wasn't quite sure what they meant. I mean, I got an idea of what they were talking about, but when I asked them to clarify it, they essentially said the spy game between Russia and America has just shifted into overdrive with the presence of President Putin. Everywhere you go, everything you say, who you talk to, who you call, who you see, all of that's being recorded, and you better know that. You better be very, very careful from here on in. So did the American intelligence community understand right away that President Putin was as dangerous as they do now?
I think by the time Putin assumed the presidency, which is 2000, by that time, they had enough experience over the 90s to realize the spy game never stopped. From the time of 1991, I think there was a desire on the part of the US government to reclaim this peace dividend that the Russians were now leaning towards the West. They were going to be democratic. They were going to be our friends. And that really didn't last terribly long, but it did seem to endure long enough that the intelligence community probably took their eyes somewhat off the ball, focusing on what they thought would be other priorities. And in 95, you have Hansen is already back spying for the Russians at that point. He had an on and off relationship over his many years of espionage, Hansen being the FBI mole who provided the identities of a number of very key CIA agents. And we knew agents were going down, so we knew the game was very much on in the mid-1990s. But I think there was a reluctance on the part of the US government overall, sort of in that 5 steps of dealing with grief, first one being denial, that Putin was going to be as bad as he was, but he had taken over the FSB in 1998, internal, successor to the KGB, and I think by that time we had a pretty good sense of his colors.
And yet there was a miscalculation at different times too, because I mean, didn't the U.S. really seek a path of appeasement? And even after, 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia, or after the Crimea in 2014, and it just seems that they kept wishing that President Putin would be somebody else.
Well, political leaders often look at the world as they wish it would be, as opposed to the way it is. And the United States was coming on the heels of 9/11, very early into Putin's tenure as president. Remember the famous comments of President George W. Bush that I looked into his eyes, I saw his soul. So I think you're spot on when saying there was a real desire and a hope that Putin would
what was
not
that
be
all
an
about?
adversary.
What was that all about? Lots of people remember that. I mean, they were able to kind of have a rapport on a one-on-one meeting, and that meant that President Bush felt that Putin was somebody he could do business with, and then I think just right before that or right after that, people don't remember now, but President Putin was invited to the U.S. and he met with students and did a tour, a little Gorbachev-esque.
Well, he was feeling his way, wasn't he, in his first terms as president? He even stepped aside on paper for Medvedev to become president for a while in 2008. But those first few years, the first 8 years of his term, again, the United States was deeply involved with 9/11, and that was clearly our focus and would be our focus, CT, counterterrorism, for the next 20 years. I think Putin was feeling his way and trying to develop relationships. He's an intelligence officer. I mean, that's how he was trained and nurtured and conditioned. So intelligence officers try to at least feign this personality of, of embracing kindness and friendship and nurturing that while really having another agenda and playing the old bait and switch as to what they're really up to.
And yet, a lot of people would argue at that time that President Putin was somewhat different, because right after 9/11, I think he was the first phone call to Washington and President Bush after the attack occurred. And then Russia opened up their airspace to allow weapons shipments to pass through Russia down into Central Asia and into Afghanistan. There was lots of intelligence sharing. There was even talk still, certainly more in President Yeltsin's era, but there was even talk still as President Putin was coming to power that, maybe there can be great cooperation between Russia and NATO. Maybe Russia would become a member of NATO one day. Certainly that was never uttered by President Putin himself, but things were very different.
I think Russia and China both were being cautious after 9/11 in terms of where they stood vis-a-vis the United States. Russia was coming out of a horrible financial crisis of 1998, which was devastating to it. Putin had, and I do believe, falsified the bombings of the apartment buildings in Moscow to allow for the Second Chechen War. And I think Putin was very focused on what he thought getting the job done in Chechnya as a bit of a quid pro quo, that the United States would leave him alone in Chechnya, building that up as a terrorist state, as an accomplice of bin Laden, if you would. So I don't really think it was until we see the events in Georgia and some of the comments Putin started to make around 2005 and 2006, where he was a bit more confident in taking a more confrontational role with the United States.
What do you mean you think that President Putin was behind the bombings, the apartment bombings?
Well, there's a great deal of press on the apartment bombings that took place over the course of 1999. I think towards the end of 1999. There were a series of apartment bombings at the Russian government, or at least Putin, as remember, he was a director of the FSB before becoming the deputy prime minister and then eventually succeeding Yeltsin.
I covered those bombings, by the way,
absolutely.
And I was there, and they were very suspicious because nobody claimed responsibility for them. And later on, there was all sorts of evidence that FSB cars left the area and were heard on the radios. And I mean, there was some pretty wild speculation that maybe President Putin and the FSB arranged these bombings as a tripwire, as an excuse to go and reinvade Chechnya. Do you actually believe it now?
I think it's credible. I couldn't say with 100% confidence, but the FSB, as you noted, the local FSB seemed to be on a different sheet of music than Patrushev, who was director of the FSB at the time, and actually arrested, I believe, 3 FSB officials who were there present with a car in the garage that had explosives at the time. The story would rather be changed later on, where they weren't really explosives. It was a test, it was a drill. But I think the early indications were credible that those were explosives, those were FSB officers, and the local FSB itself were those who investigated and were putting those individuals on trial. So I think the evidence is rather compelling. I think maybe the U.S. government in its classified holdings has a more accurate sense of it, but just from the likes of open source information, it seems credible to me.
Let's shift gears a little bit. Do station chiefs in the CIA write assessments of President Putin? Like, would a Moscow station chief assess whether Putin would push the button on a nuclear device? Are his members of his inner circle, are they solidly behind him, or are there cracks in that inner circle? I mean, how editorial do those assessments become? You must have written many of them. And do the policymakers, i.e. the President of the United States, read those and listen to them?
Well, there's different vehicles for a chief of station to express his or her point of view or perspective on developing events in their country. There's operational traffic, which goes strictly to the operational personnel in their chain of command. But there is a vehicle, an intelligence product, a raw intelligence product, which goes to the community, but it's only by requirement. There's a certain name and a nomenclature which I can't share with you, but if there's a desire on the part of policymakers to hear what the chief of station thinks on the head of state, unrest in a local country, they will request that product. The chief of station then writes his or her assessment, but drawing on intelligence. The assessment has to be based on reporting that has already been disseminated to the community. So in a way, it's somewhat an analytical product, but it's done in the form of a raw intelligence product. And it's done rarely, but it is usually in a time of unrest, tension, near conflict, some instability, where the senior decision makers want to hear from the chief of station.
What do you think they're writing about President Putin right now? If you were chief of state, if you were chief of station right now in Moscow, I get the impression from reading some of the things that you've written that you would not be writing that he is mentally unstable or that President Putin is. You don't buy into the crazy Putin theory.
No, he's not. I don't think he's crazy. I don't even think he's reckless. I just think he sees the world through a lens that we have real trouble understanding as Westerners, as people who live in a liberal democracy and outside the intelligence profession. I don't know necessarily that the chief of station has to do a lot of that, because I think the intelligence tells the story. The intelligence reporting that I imagine is coming from human sources, signals intelligence, and other forms of collection are itself providing a clinical picture and portrait of Putin, his style, certainly what we've seen unclassified by the United States government and the British government as well, in terms of plans, intentions, and capabilities, reveals a pretty consistent picture that Putin has a plan. It's not necessarily a good plan or a successful plan, and it is, unfortunately, based on a calculus working off a false picture of what's going on, because his intelligence services really aren't providing an accurate strategic picture. Instead, it's really just an echo chamber of his predetermined perspectives and points of view.
You wrote recently, and I hope you don't mind me quoting, and we can do this in a podcast, and I think that's what's great about doing this instead of on live television where you don't have time. But let me just quote it. Policymakers would do well to remember three fundamentals that guide Putin's decision-making. One, he's the product of the 70s and 80s KGB and stood witness in then East Germany in 1990 and in 1991 when the world knew it ceased to exist. Two, ego, survival, greed, and ambition direct his moral compass. And three, he's come to believe his own propaganda. So that's a little bit about what you were just saying about this echo chamber, that in terms of his realities and how he perceives things, there's a lot of haze that he's looking through.
Well, you have to remember when Putin came into the KGB, and I suspect it's still very much the same, it wasn't like, you applied online or walked into the KGB office. The KGB looked for people, and generally it looked for people who'd been informers who were cooperating already with them or with the Communist Party. In Putin's case, my presumption is when he was at Leningrad State University pursuing his degrees, which included one in law, that he was in fact reporting on his students, because he didn't come from a particularly prestigious family. He didn't have a legacy connection, as far as I understand, to the Communist Party or the Soviet system, or specifically the intel services. So the KGB would have had to have enough comfort and confidence in him to recruit him into the service, because they had already been working with him. Once in the service, he was told, you're part of the elite, you're the vanguard of the party, you're here to protect the party, and the party is everything. And the party is everything also personally and professionally. It's how one advances, and one advances through this kleptocracy, the corruption and the nepotism and patronage that goes along with the system. And that system is dominant over the immoral and decadent West. We hear comments from Putin and his inner circle, which you could just take straight out of 1970s Soviet propaganda, because that's what he grew up on. That's what he believes. And then, in fact, he did go overseas, and what we understand to be his only official overseas posting in Dresden, in what was then East Germany, and he watched his world fall apart. He was there when the wall fell in November of 1989. He was there when
Yeah.
protesters were storming the Stasi local headquarters across the street from his office. So those had a great impact.
By the way,
on
in his book, right, that he
Yeah.
stood out there while
Yep.
everybody's celebrating in the streets freedom. This great moment in history as the Berlin Wall is coming down. He's standing there. He pulls out a handgun and he's ready to shoot them should they come into the Stasi headquarters. He sees it as this great, not great, dark moment in Soviet history.
Yeah, I don't think it was quite as heroic as he claims in his own writing. According to Stasi officers and KGB officers of his same tenure, like the rest of the KGB, he was hiding under his desk and hoping that the protesters weren't coming across the street to their building, but they were busy burning and shredding documents at the time, expecting that it might happen. But it was for him catastrophic. It was, his world coming apart, as it was for so many KGB officers, Communist Party officials at the time.
You also wrote that there's no rules, only consequences that shape his calculus. And you wrote that in the context of would Putin push the button? Would Russia use nuclear weapons? Can you expand on that a bit?
I think it's dangerous when the liberal democracies, the West, NATO, look at the world as having a set of rules that everyone respects. Putin's outlook is those rules were created by the liberal democracies to keep Russia down, to oppress what was the Soviet Union coming out of World War II, and then Russia as it emerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union. So those aren't rules he accepts. So I think when we get together and go, well, he's breaking the rules and stuff, those aren't his rules. In fact, if he was acknowledging rules of his predecessors, there'd be no war in Ukraine. Ukraine, the Russian Federation, the United States made an agreement in the mid-90s when Ukraine turned over its nuclear weapons that respected the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine, which he has no use for. So what has impacted Putin's calculus isn't a rule, United Nations Charter or a treaty, but what is it in it? What's in it for him, or what could hurt him? And when there are consequences, that's what sets his behavior. And I think it's important to look at that to understand what he's going to do, and particularly as we hope to at some point transition the conflict into negotiations. There have to be consequences for his actions that would get Putin to consider withdrawing, making changes, or restraint.
What kind of consequences? Because if we're looking down the road, this is only going to get worse, right? And if Ukraine becomes better armed, and there are discussions, every day about giving them weapons that they haven't had before, the West continually seems to be shifting in terms of what they're willing to do because they want Ukraine to win this thing, and they see that the cost of Ukraine losing is a price tag simply too high for Europe, because Putin will move on and threaten other countries as well. So then you have the discussion moving on to Crimea, and that Crimea certainly comes directly in the crosshairs of the Ukrainian military. So if I take the picture you paint about Putin, and whether he would use a nuclear weapon or not, or how desperate he may become, and when he's backed into a corner, what he might do, forgive me for the long question, but none of that adds up to anything good.
I subscribe to the theory that though we find it head-scratching to understand, that Putin took this action in Ukraine, both in 2014 and again in 2022, because he actually felt Ukraine's development, its evolution of its relations with the West, was a direct threat to him and his power. I think the key issue for Putin is retaining power and dying a peaceful death. And from what I've seen in open source, which I put some confidence in, he was very much moved by scenes of Muammar Gaddafi's demise in Libya during the time of the Arab Spring, seeing him, pulled out of a sewer, beaten to a pulp, and then ultimately shot, losing power. And I think that's his nightmare scenario, is that losing power in such a way. So what Putin is motivated by, better or for worse, is his power, that which stabilizes his power and that which threatens his power. And I subscribe to the theory that he believed he had to do something about Ukraine to at least secure Crimea and preempt the influence a prospering, pluralistic Ukraine would have on his own country right next door, by trying to do something about it. I think similarly, that which we can leverage that both incentivizes his belief by taking path A and path B, he'll secure his power in a situation, whereas path C and D threaten his position, is probably going to have more impact because it's based on consequences, not on any set of rules or negotiations.
You know, there are so many Russians who, and I'd appreciate your comment on it, who believe that if you look at the Orange Revolution, which I covered in Ukraine, and then later on the Maidan Revolution, that this was the West, that this wasn't a natural uprising by Ukrainians who wanted to join the EU or wanted to join NATO or wanted to be closer to Europe. This was the US in there fixing the field, the CIA, paying for those people to be in the street, that this was a conspiracy by NATO. You know, what do you say to them when you look back at those events? And I cover them, and certainly I know from my personal experience in the street, I mean, these were Ukrainians at a heartfelt moment who felt that the democracy was being stolen from them. But I mean, Russia has spun this myth that it was a Western conspiracy.
I think one of the things Putin has done extremely well is the messaging and narrative in his own domestic population. I think it's absolutely true that a majority of Russians, at least Russians of an older generation, very much believe the stories that Russian state media report, and really that's where they get their information from, Russian state media. The young, how many hundreds of thousands apparently have already left, those who don't depend necessarily on Russian state media, but those who, particularly those who remember the 1998 financial crisis, and they think about the Moscow apartment buildings, really do see Putin as their heroic savior, as their strongman. And you've lived there, Dana, and I hope you'll take some confidence in my comments that Russians prefer stability over anything else, and they will make trade-offs for their own rights for stability because they've seen a lot of instability in their lives.
Sure, and so you track them in public opinion polls.
Oh, yes.
And you ask them about democracy, which you and I mean, we grew up on. You know, that it's like drinking water for us. And they see chaos.
Yes, they do.
In parallel with democracy and lawlessness. And you know, Putin was Mr. Stability at one point. Is he now?
To some point, at least the messaging that he puts out, he's stability in sense of the domestic situation. I don't think the economy has been rocked to the extent that the West thought it was going to be by sanctions. I think over time, it'll continue to pinch. I think Putin has been very careful about prioritizing mobilization among ethnic minorities, remote regions, as opposed to, if you would, his political base, if we want to refer to his political base, of the more urban, suburban, and affluent Russian communities in St. Petersburg and Moscow and those areas. So I think he's done a good job. I don't think it can last forever. I think the economic impact, I think the loss of lives will take their toll. But even so, I don't see the unrest being that which takes him down. I don't see the millions of people, it's 140 million people in that country, coming out to the street. I think it would be people who are taking a loss closer to Putin, who might be more likely to act on him than it would be a great revolution. But who's to say at this point?
Well, let's hear your prediction. Does Putin survive this? Or do you think that this is his final chapter, the invasion of and failed war in Ukraine?
I would be inclined to think he survives it. I'd be inclined to think that Putin at some point will create his own off-ramp, which will look very heroic and glorious and successful. But I don't eliminate the possibility. You know, intelligence, we talk about high confidence assessments, low confidence assessments. So my high confidence assessment is he survives it and finds his own off-ramp if there's sufficient pressure on him, if the cohesion of the alliance remains, and if the West continues to provide Ukraine the weapons it needs and gives them maybe a little more maneuvering room to hurt Putin. But I also would say there's a low confidence possibility that he doesn't survive it, that he's unseated by those in his own inner circle who probably have the greatest capacity to do so, rather than some massive uprising in the street.
Douglas London, formerly with the CIA for more than 3 decades. It's really been an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's been my pleasure.